very much for the intro, Carlo. Lovely to meet everybody as well. So I wanted to start off this session by actually diving into why we're talking about the AI-enabled hacks these days, why vulnerability windows are actually getting smaller, why you're seeing everything in the news left, right, and centre talking about this, and sort of why it's important, and in many ways why you shouldn't panic as well. So we'll cover all of that very quickly. I have done a little bit of a presentation just to guide the workflow through it, just hopefully to educate everybody. So I will just go ahead and share that. So just give me 2 seconds while I get that lined up. Hopefully it won't be like school again. Right, let me click the right button. Apologies. There we go. Right, let's go ahead. Wonderful. So I will just get cracking in and talking about all the different sort of elements I'm going to go through today. So I want to talk about why it is changing all of the time, how attackers are actually using AI to speed up these sort of vulnerability-based attacks, what AI has actually changed in the environment, and again, why we've seen everything from Mythos and, oh, let me just get rid of that. Nobody wants to see themselves. Why we're seeing sort of Mythos and Fable and everything like that make the news at the moment, what the biggest challenges for business when it comes to vulnerability management, and ultimately, what you guys can do about it. We're here to learn and we're here to work out why we can get these things sorted. So let me just spin that through. So to start with, the reason that it's called a shrinking window and the reason that this is becoming more and more apparent is because the vulnerability window is shrinking every day in terms of how long you've got to remediate these vulnerabilities, which naturally pop up every day on different applications within configurations and in different areas of the business, from your domains to your ports to everything that you can think of. There's vulnerabilities left, right, and center. And the reason that these are sort of shrinking is because AI has essentially sped up the speed in which attackers can find and exploit these vulnerabilities if they are exploitable. So traditionally, what most people are still used to are having a one-off security vulnerability style assessment done either annually, quarterly, whatever makes sense. And it's this that's sort of been the case for, the past 10, 20 years, even further when we're talking about managing vulnerabilities. And it's a format that people are familiar with. But the problem that you have with this is that it was always a single point in time assessment, and it was always a single screen that showed you what vulnerabilities were available then, but it didn't cover how long they'd been available for. It didn't cover the actual remediation of them, and it didn't cover the fact that by the time that some people were getting to fix these vulnerabilities, there had been evidence left, right, and center of them actually being exploited. So in the world that we're getting into now, with AI helping attackers speed things up and with AI helping us remediate them, we are moving towards a world that's based around continuous vulnerability management. And you'll see this sort of talked about again in the news. You'll see governments changing their stance towards this. I'll talk about the case over here in the UK that we've got going on, where the NCSE is essentially forcing this ongoing vulnerability management. You'll see this change in SOC 2 and ISO 27001 and all of the million of different compliance frameworks around the world, because the question has changed from when did we last do a scan, what did our last vulnerability assessment say, to actually what is exposed right now, what could somebody potentially leverage within our environment. So the biggest change that's happened, and I'll go into the sort of detail of this later on, is because where we've got these automated tools and where hackers are using AI to do the complete attack from front to finish, which I'll cover and when we talk about Mythos and things like that later, is because the vulnerability is selecting the victim these days, rather than the other way around, where attackers would go out and find different organizations or businesses that they wanted to target. So the problem that you've got here is that they find the weakness before they know who owns it, before they care who owns it, before they know its potential, good opportunity for them, because they've got tools that will allow them to automatically scan systems. It allows them to match softwares and version numbers. It allows them to test known vulnerabilities. You'll see every Patch Tuesday, for example, Microsoft gives you a list of everything that's currently being exploited. And after it's found all of that information and found a doorway into different organizations, only then does it identify by the organization itself. They don't really have they don't care whether you're a small business or a large business these days. They just know that they've got a door and they're going to go ahead and try and cause trouble, ransomware, all of the different type of attacks that you can have. So the problem is with the software becoming exposed and with exposed software being known, it just makes a giant Google search for organizations that they could potentially attack. And all it takes is one weakness. All it takes is one vulnerability in the wrong place at the wrong time to actually cause an exploitable attack. So when we're talking about hackers using AI-enabled tools, so there's already loads on the market. You see these getting used for vendors that do bug bounty programs and things like that. They'll use Burp Suite or other kind of pre-made tools or things based on Claude and ChatGPT to essentially find the exposed system, run the code. A lot of the vulnerabilities that exploited are the evaluation of privilege vulnerabilities. So this means that any vulnerability that essentially allows the attacker to gain administrator rights and then get into sort of different areas of the business then, so they can get to emails, backups, files, all from a simple unrelated vulnerability. And it's the chain itself rather than the vulnerability score. So, we're seeing cases on our side of people getting access to systems from lower vulnerabilities, where it was always traditionally the higher rated ones, if you're familiar with things like CVSS score, that were particularly to be worried about. That being said, it sounds like I've said that every single vulnerability is a potential risk to the business. Now, the beauty of IT and the beauty of layered approaches and the beauty of having the other security systems in place is that quite often your MFA, your firewalls, your other sort of security-based items, your MDR, your EDR solutions, all help prevent these people getting access via those vulnerabilities in the first place. So, and there's many reasons why, you can imagine with these kind of tools available, why isn't everybody getting hacked left, right, and center? It's because quite often the services aren't actually exposed to the internet. Quite often they're hitting the blocker on credentials or user action being required, which is why MFA is the most powerful tool in the world at the moment and probably the thing that's preventing a lot of these attacks happening. It may be that the vulnerable configuration isn't present in that particular case, or it may be there are other security controls that interrupt the attack. But the reason why it still matters is because, as you can imagine, one of these things fails, one of these other sort of security setups that you have in place falls through, like you've made an exception for somebody having MFA, for example, and then you've got this, perfect path into your network or into your organization that they could potentially exploit. And the reason why we're talking about continuous vulnerability management now is because it's the continuous remediation that closes all of the doors and essentially prevents these exploits from ever being a risk. So, you've got constantly changing environments. You've got new IT tools being rolled out. You've got, this ongoing battle against your own compliance that you have to deal with. So the best thing that you can do as an organization is make sure your house is tidy, for lack of a better way of putting it, to make sure that if somebody does get in, then they don't have an easy path through. So why does AI make the same attacks faster and cheaper than traditionally? So like I said, we're moving away from a world that was doing these point-in-time vulnerability assessments, or many organizations that weren't particularly concerned about their vulnerabilities at all and would let their RMMs do all of the hard work when it comes to patch management and things like that. Now, the evidence is out there that in the last 6 months alone, these attacks are getting faster, they're getting more adaptive, they're becoming more scalable because they don't have to spend so long researching. They can get the AI tool to do the complete threat. They can do the complete attack just from a single platform. They can have more attempts. They can keep going after a failure. They can find alternative routes in. And the speed of which this is happening is just going to carry on getting faster and faster and faster. And you'll see in the news, everyone talks about this AI versus AI battle. And it's completely true, because the tools that are designed to prevent are also the tools that can enable people to attack. And it's actually working out the perfect balance of the two that's going to be the real problem and solution here. So I'll put this quote at the bottom: it doesn't guarantee success, it increases the speed and number of credible attempts. And that's why it's an actual speed game at the end of the day rather than anything at all, which we'll cover very shortly. So I've put a couple of stats here, not to scare people, because I said it's down to your entire IT environment that actually means that you have a lot of this protection in place. And again, continuous vulnerability management is designed to have that good cyber hygiene, have that good security so that if somebody does get in, they can't really go any further than that. But the data that's been pulled from everyone's seen Mythos in the news, everybody's seen Fable 5 in the news, but the data that got pulled from that is the most sort of jarring at all. And I've just read another article this morning that talks about how this is just going to get more and more problematic, but again, not in a fear-mongering way, but in a way that people are just going to have to step up their own security methods. So talking about Mythos in particular, and Mythos Preview, which is where all of this controversy sort of started back in May. The problem was that they got Mythos to essentially complete capture the flag style challenges, where they said to Mythos, go ahead and exploit this particular thing, try and get access to these credentials to this bit of data. And Mythos succeeded in that attack for 73% of the use cases presented to it, which is an incredibly high amount, considering the fact that Mythos was a tool designed to help prevent people against it. Again, in 73% of cases, it was actually the cause of the hack and the attack itself. The other information that was really, really interesting from the Mythos experiment is that they did these kind of corporate network simulated attack, which they called the last ones, which covered everything from the initial reconnaissance to the full network takeover, of which there is normally 32 stages. It depends what path you look down, that depends what model you use, but there's normally 32 stages to complete attack from start to finish. And 3 out of 10 of those attempts that they made, they managed to complete all 32 stages. And actually, the average across all of these attacks that they simulated was that it managed to get to stage 22 out of 32 stages as well. So what we're talking about here is not just we've accidentally got into an infrastructure bureau vulnerability. These are actually tried and tested AI taking people from the start of the attack to the end of the attack and doing a complete network takeover in many cases as well. So Fable 5 and Mythos 5 are now in general release. Mythos is only available to certain organizations, but Fable 5 is available to everybody. I know in June there was all of the hubbub around the US locking it down because they found as soon as they released it, somebody managed to get into it and use it for damage and for malicious reasons. So they obviously took it back offline, and there's all the controversy around whether the US should have had that much control, which I won't go into on this call. I'll let people explore that in their own time. But ultimately, they realized that this kind of technology had to have even further safeguards in place, and that's generally what they've done now. And again, you can use these models now to help with your own vulnerability management if you wish to. I wanted to cover very briefly about the impact that this has on every organization, because I know that in the news you see different organizations experience cyber attacks left, right, and center these days, from big car manufacturers to we've had some schools over here in the UK to, there's every single month there's a new big organization, and people kind of get themselves into the comfortable position of thinking, yes, sure, that happens to them because they're targets. But the reality is, and the data is proving, that this is happening more to smaller organizations and to, charities and hospitals and schools, when it really never really affected those people originally. So this is the problem with the AI thing. It's not, it's not, just trying to think of the right word. It's not biased on large corporations anymore. And the problem is, everybody has essentially become a target. So, it's talking about the fact that public systems can be found before the owner is known. This just means that people are looking at data and not really seeing who the end user of that data is, which is why we're seeing an uptick of attacks, especially in the last 12 months among charities in particular, which is a really sad day, because those are organizations that are designed to help people, but also the organizations that have more limited IT resources and competing priorities and can't necessarily put these kind of measures in place. They also, smaller organizations and these sort of cash-strapped ones will also have older systems. They won't have the resource, and downtime itself can be quite catastrophic. So this goes, I've told you a lot about the problem, and that the fact that AI-enabled attacks are making attacks faster, more common, more agnostic in terms of not particularly targeting the larger organizations. And it can all very well get into a realm of worrying about all of these vulnerabilities that you have open. But the actual solution to remediating these and mitigating is fairly straightforward, albeit it is some cyber hygiene administrative work that not everybody has the time or space to be able to do. So it involves making sure that you know exactly what assets you've got connected to your environment. It involves validating the findings, working out what's a false positive, what's a real vulnerability, how exploitable that vulnerability is. It involves prioritizing the risk based on CVSS score, based on exposure, based on application. It's making sure that you've got somebody assigned to remediate it. It's making sure that that gets fixed. And then finally, it's making sure that you actually fix the thing that you set out to in the first place as well. So I really particularly like this quote: a scanner without a follow through becomes a backlog. And that's very case. And that's what we saw traditionally with doing annual vulnerability assessments. They would complete the assessment, they'd give the work to somebody to do. And lo and behold, by the time the next one came around 12 months, they hadn't really managed to get on top of the vulnerabilities. And more importantly, they had a bunch of new ones to be able to fix as well. So this slide here just gives that into more context. It talks about the point in time versus continuous. And I wanted to talk about Cyber Essentials Plus because this is our sort of UK government mandated cybersecurity certification, which pretty much all businesses are expected to have in the UK now. It's not enforced, but I don't think it's very long until it will be. And traditionally, Cyber Essentials, again, was a point-in-time assessment. It did look at vulnerabilities. It did say that anything of the 7 or higher should be closed within 14 days. But in April this year, the ISAME, who control this, who work with the NCSE, work with the UK's GCHQ and everybody like that, basically did a massive switch into this assessment and said, if you have vulnerabilities older than 14 days, this assessment now automatically fails. We don't give any excuses to this. It doesn't matter what the score of that vulnerability is. If you don't close it within 14 days, it fails. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, it's the time windows of vulnerabilities that are closing because the AI-enabled hackers are able to get to these vulnerabilities faster and more at scale. So the change that happened in April has affected a lot of businesses, and a lot of people are being forced into moving to continuous vulnerability management strategies, but they don't need to be that complicated. They don't need to be that hard. There are many, many people trying to help businesses solve this problem and build an operating rhythm around it. And the last slide, I just want to summarize the speed is the contest here. It's not actually against technology. The challenge here is actually getting these vulnerabilities closed as quickly as they are being opened. And I've put some references here in case anybody wants to read them. But I think, Mikhail, this would be a really natural point to hand over to you to talk about what you and the team have been working on to help solve this.
Right. Thanks, Liz. So let me just get this up for you guys. Yeah, so a lot of the time we see problems with the vulnerability windows closing. It's the time for engineers and companies to actually get get those areas patched and close the gap. So with our offering at BC Tech, we have an offering called SecOps 360. It's basically a solution that helps bring in all your areas of vulnerabilities into a single pane glass view. So this allows our team to actually look at your tenant as a whole and actually work through your vulnerabilities from your external, your internal, your application, your third-party applications, your Windows patches, and it basically brings it all into a window which allows us to provide remediation for you, also to investigate those findings and help you close that gap. So as you mentioned, it's the actual speed of it now has improved, and doesn't mean that if you have a vulnerability, you're going to get compromised. However, with having those vulnerabilities, we need to close that gap so that if ever there is a finding that's now compromised, you've actually closed that gap for that. So in turn, actually protecting your environment. So I'm going to take you guys through the dashboard just to give you a view and the layout of the offering that we have, and just talk that we look into and how we actually use this tool to drive remediation in your business. So firstly, we presented with a nice consolidated view of the tenant. So you get to see our most vulnerable application. No joke, it's actually Google Chrome. So from this dashboard, we get to see we have our worst CVE. We don't have servers onboarded on our demo tenant. We get to see our worst workstation. We get to get a nice summary of how many devices we're actually reporting on, how many with critical findings, how many with high, medium, and low. So it actually consolidates everything. So you don't have to go and export and run rules and clean up your data to see it. It actually consolidates it all for you in one screen. We get to see a nice CVE change across devices over time. We get to see how many CVEs have been added to our tenant versus how many we've remediated. This is a good for reporting factor to actually show how we're tracking against latest vulnerabilities. We get to get a quick summary of our top 5 vulnerable devices, vulnerable apps, and CVEs. If you notice, there is a button that says Fix Now, and this is where the power of the tool comes in. It allows us to create customized schedules and immediate fixes for these vulnerabilities. So along with your business requirements, our team, of course, will do an assessment within your environment. If you have any legacy applications that cannot be patched, which we see quite often, we could make custom rules as well as custom installers that will allow you to patch or remediate those legacy applications to the best known working version. So an example I'll use, you have Google Chrome in your environment, and for any business particular reason you can't upgrade Chrome to the latest version, we can help you to find the most stable version for your business. So I'm just going to use layman terms of versions. So version 1 is what you're currently on, and version 5 is the latest version. We can help you patch to the best working version, so example version 3, and we can then build a custom installer for version 3, and we can actually use that to deploy it across your tenant. It basically simplifies the vulnerability management for it. Yes, we won't be on the latest version, but at least we'll have track of that. From an external perspective, we get a lot of vulnerabilities that we don't know about. For example, our websites. And usually we get this on a once a yearly scan where we'll get auditors to come through, or we'll get a pen tester to come through, and they'll run a scan against our external assets. Then we see these vulnerabilities, and as Liz was mentioning, you either get to fix them in a period or you don't, and then comes the next cycle and you actually find out that you have more and you potentially haven't remediated your previous scan items. So what we offer is a continuous external vulnerability scanner. So we could run this in a schedule, can run it daily, weekly, hourly, monthly, yearly. If you want, we do recommend we do it weekly. So we'll have the cycle where we will run this, call it once a week, and we will present the data to you along with remediating items for it. So we can run scans against public-facing IP addresses. We can run scans against website and domains. And then we'll be presented with CVEs and vulnerabilities for those items that we scanned. They are non-intrusive scans, so we can run a light, non-authenticated scan against these entities, or we can run an authenticated scan. As we move on, we get to get a quick view. So a lot of the time you have your AV, your EDR, XDR platform have their own dashboard, and this is where your techs will usually need to log in to view if your endpoints do have protection or if there's any problems with it. So what this tool also allows us to do is to have a quick overview of your company standpoint with the AV solution. So as you can see, we do run a third-party AV in our test environment. So you can see it is listed as a third-party AV. And you do see we have 3 listed as Windows Defender. So the tool does look for Defender, and if it does see another AV on the endpoint, it will mark it as a third party, and we can drill down to actually see what endpoint protection it does have. But from a quick view, if we look at this window and we actually see, okay, our company does run a third party AV solution. So we do have this number. We have 64 devices. However, only 61 are protected. So we say, okay, there's 3 that actually have Defender. That raises a concern. Why are 3 endpoints working with Defender and not our in-house AV platform that we use? So from bringing everything into a single pane for us to view, this gives us a quick view of problems that we could find that could help us close the gap. Moving on, we get to see our OS updates. We get to see endpoints that have missing updates, and it gives us a nice number of it. Get to see critical security and devices that require reboots. Again, bringing everything into a single pane for us to view. From this window, we can action those updates. We can initiate updates via automation rules. So if you have maintenance windows or downtime periods, we can set it up that those updates will run in those windows. When we get our LAN scanner, this is another vital component, and we actually help deliver internal layer 2 scans. So a lot of the time in businesses, we have devices such as APs, or we have a switch with the unmanaged switch sitting in it. This allows us to run layer 2 scans within your network, and it'll actually present us with those devices. And it'll actually give us a listing if they have any open ports or vulnerabilities on those devices. Now, just to mention, if it's an endpoint with an agent on it, we can remediate. However, if it does not have an agent on it, we cannot remediate. So an example we could, and I will show you guys an example of this. If we run a layer 2 scan and we pick up, there might be 3 unmanaged switches sitting in a cabinet somewhere, and there's actually open ports and vulnerabilities on it. We will be able to see it, however, we'll not be able to remediate it because the switch will not have our agent on it. So I'll go a bit more into detail with that if we have some more time. But basically, the layer 2 scan allows us to run continuous internal scans. So we can pick up if there's anybody that's plugged in a device that's not supposed to be on your network. This will also help us map that out for us. Also, part of it is to know what assets are in your network, and then it allows us to actually protect those assets. So if we end up running a scan and we find that there's 20 odd endpoints that you do not know are, and we can actually find ghost endpoints sitting on your network. Moving on, we get to get a consolidated view of disk management. And in this aspect, it's your encryption. Encryption is a big thing with security. And as you can see, we have 11 unencrypted devices out of 64. Gives you a nice holistic view of how you're tracking with hardening your devices. So again, quick access, we get to see which devices are a problem, and then of course, plan remediation for those devices. We cannot initiate encryption from this platform, but we can help you drive remediation for that. So then we just get a quick summary of those devices. We also get a quick view summary of load disk space. Also could raise a concern in a security item if the machine's using too much space that's unknown for unknown reasons. And yeah, we get to dive deeper into it and actually investigate the cause. Moving on, we do get to tie into your Entra tenant, so we can plug directly into your Microsoft Entra. This will give us another consolidated view on account security. As Liz mentioned, MFA is probably one of your best first-line defenses with these vulnerabilities and compromise. So as you can see, it gives us a quick summary: how many global admins without MFA, how many guest accounts without MFA, and how many users without MFA. So what this tool allows us to do is we'll actually get to see this quickly straight off the bat. This is on the main dashboard screen. We can then help you build policies and MFA policies for your tenant. So we can help you meet the targets of these recommendations so we can actually get your tenant secure. A lot of the time as well, we've noticed guest accounts are left on the tenant and they're not in use, which poses an additional risk. So we can help you clean that up and actually close that gap of leaving unmanaged guest accounts in your tenant. So we do get a quick consolidated view of your hardware. So we get to see how many end-of-life systems are in your environment, how many workstations and servers. And then this is just a comparative of your Entra tenant, how many devices are actually on your Entra tenant versus how many are onboarded on our platform. Cool. I'm just going to switch over to get this to work. So our external scanner, I'd just like to touch on both our scanner options quickly. So from an external standpoint, we get to plug in your IP addresses. Of course, you can provide that to us and any of your public facing domains. And what this allows us to do is to run a quick scan against these items. It's not an intense scan, but it does help us pick up these minor vulnerabilities and exposures on those public facing entities. When we find that, we can then help you remediate and close those gaps or those open ports. So it's a quick and actionable item that can actually reduce that attack vector. Moving on to the LAN scanner, and as I made the example of the 3 unmanaged switches sitting in a cabinet somewhere in your environment. So as you can see, we ran the scan on the network, and you can actually see we picked up 3 Ubiquiti devices that were unpatched, and these devices are unmanaged devices, which we actually found out that they are unmanaged and they have problems, in which we did onboard them to a management platform and we planned remediation for them. So the solution allows us to actually bring everything into a single pane for us. And then we get to help you with the technical skills from the SecOps team. We get to find these things for you. And then we actually compile the remediation into a single pack for you. We can meet with you once a week or whatever schedule you want. And then we can actually help you and you can action your remediation items. Thanks, Connor. I think that's pretty much it from the dashboard view and the offering.
Thanks, Mikhail. That's pretty good, and thank you, Liz, as well for that discussion, that presentation. Just as a reminder to everyone, we are taking questions now, and we have actually received a few questions during the course of this webinar, as well as some from before, from other clients. So I will just raise up the question that we've gotten, and then either Liz or Mikhail will be able to give the input on the question. So the first question that we got was, how do I know which vulnerabilities actually matter the most?
I can take that one. So the real answer is you don't, because the problem is once a vulnerability becomes known as being exploitable. So again, Microsoft releases every month on Patch Tuesday. There's a US system called SecOps, which gives a score to the exploited vulnerabilities. By the time they're on that list, they have already been exploited enough at scale that obviously these organizations have got to join them to that attention. So there are a couple of things that you can do. A lot of people are still using the CVSS score, which scores the vulnerability based on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest. A lot of people use 7 or higher as a general guidance to target those vulnerabilities first. But we have seen vulnerabilities at the lower end be exploited, albeit extremely rarely and normally in quite a low touch point of thing as well. Hence why I think the Cyber Essentials in the UK have just made it blank to all vulnerabilities 14 days, because the reality is you don't always know. But there are ways you can prioritize them. You can look at the highest threatening ones first, but the best practice would be to continuously remediate as many as you humanly can.
Yeah. Just to add to what Liz mentioned there, so that is a good question, and we do get it a lot, because if you look at a tenant, or if we do a scan, there's so many vulnerabilities. Where do we start? So part of our offering is when we come in and we help you with this and we do an assessment, we actually start working through, if you could call it like a risk assessment. We look at the critical assets. Is this vulnerability going to be critical? Is an isolated host? Is it just kept in a room for capturing assets from a stock room? So we actually go through that. We understand your business. We learn your business. And we actually go through it with you. So we're not just going to give you, Mr. Customer, here's a view of 10,000 vulnerabilities. We're going to actually work with you. We'll do, if we could call it like active threat intelligence on your environment. What's your biggest risk to your lowest risks? And then, of course, work through the remediation list with you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Just going on through these questions over here. The next one was, can attackers find us even if they are not specifically targeting our business? I can assume that perhaps attackers just do a wide search on who it is that they can attack, right?
Yeah, they kind of start with the vulnerabilities first, so they'll scan like various as you can imagine, it's really easy to guess a password these days because it's just a random combination of letters, etc. It's really also easy to guess IPs and domains just using AI tools. So they widely will scan for exposed remote access services, unpatched software, default configurations, open ports, and they really only need to guess your IP to be able to do this, which is why a lot of vulnerability management, as Mikhail showed, starts with scanning those domains and IPs first. So they normally find the vulnerability first and work out who you are later, and then decide whether they want to spend time on pushing further or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So with that, yes, they are, I could even say thousands of intel sources out there that you can use. And I'm not sure if people are familiar, but even if you go take a look at Shodan, So there are tools that run scans of across billion IPs looking for open ports, looking for vulnerabilities. And this is why we say we need to close that gap, because they might not be looking for you specifically, but if they find a vulnerability that they have an exploit for, they're of course going to find all the listed entities with that vulnerability, and then of course attack those because they know how to exploit it. So if you do contain one of those vulnerabilities, then yeah, you could be the next target.
And
Yeah,
usually, if you have one vulnerability, you've probably got many. So it's sort of like everything comes tumbling down if you have one crack in the wall.
Absolutely. And Mikhail mentioned the Shodan. Shodan, they call it the attacker's search engine because it gives that level of exposure to the different vulnerabilities that people have as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We've got another one here. I assume that this is for Mikhail. Mikhail, how resource intensive is the program or the dashboard that you showed, and does it do asset management as well?
Guys, so from a resource perspective on your machine, it's a local agent that we need to install. That agent's very lightweight. We did some baselines on it. I think its maximum usage at a given time was like at 40 megs of RAM usage. Storage doesn't use anything locally, but it ships up to the cloud dashboard, which we see. So from a system resource usage, it's very light, and it's not continuous usage, but more of a check-in and check-out between the endpoint and the console. From an asset perspective, it's not necessarily a full-blown asset manager. However, any device that's onboarded onto the platform, we do get quite a good amount of information that can be utilized in building the asset manager. So if you need to look up an endpoint, you can get a lot of information based off that endpoint.
Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks, Mikhail. We had quite an interesting question over here as well. And we live in a world where return on investment is everything, and whether the return is a reduction in vulnerabilities or an increase in streamlining, etc. And Mikhail, you were talking about how you basically do a consultative approach towards customers to understand their business and provide a solution based on that. But how can someone within the IT department, once they've taken this on, how can they prove to management or customers or auditors that the risk has been reduced?
So with this platform, Carlo, we will provide reporting. So we do get quite rich intel from the platform. So we can customize reporting specifically to your requirements. And we can also show you trend data. So I'm not sure if you remember on the main dashboard screen, you could actually see a trend analysis of how you measure up against how many listed vulnerabilities there are and how many you've remediated. So we can definitely show tracking progress. So from date of commence, when we start working, we can actually start tracking and showing you this is what you had on day X, and this is what you have now. And during that process, we'll provide weekly, monthly reporting. So every progress step that we make, we will report on it and provide the customer with the information on it. So there's a true show of value in it, as we will have enough data to present to Exco or to customers on how well you're tracking against the vulnerabilities on the tenant. So there's definitely, we will provide information on that.
And also some customers, especially international ones, if you're dealing with them, there's a certain standard of protection that is required and mandated, right, Liz? That would be the case essentially. It's almost like the international law trumps local law, right?
Yeah, and I think the problem is every different compliance framework out there wants this to be tracked and presented very differently. However, they all pull down to the same thing, being able to track which vulnerability it was, what score was, when it was raised, when it was remediated, and having the logs to show that remediation. For applications, for example, that's just a record that that particular application got patched to the latest version. For configuration vulnerabilities, that could be evidence that a local policy do. That seems to be universal in terms of that being accepted for different frameworks and different laws. And this all falls into data protection as well, unfortunately. We live in a world where we have to follow the rules and be able to evidence back that to people. So yeah. But it sounds like, as Mikhail said, just having a report of that on a schedule that you need and presenting that data back ticks that box very easily for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you. We just have one final question, unless anyone else wants to ask a question to the panel. The question came in from Brian. How do you prioritize the findings from the scans?
Yeah, sure, Liz, I can take that one. So when it comes to prioritizing the findings, as I said previously as well, we will look at, of course, do a risk assessment on your tenant. But a lot of the time we will structure it. And if you look, we will have critical findings, we will have high, medium, and low. So if we look at it from a critical level, there's usually a response type to it or a time to remediate. So we'll, of course, put that SLA into play. And of course, if it's external facing entity, such as your website, of course, that window closes. So if it's a critical, we'll have to get on it immediately to remediate it. So we'll always work off your highest CBSS score and then work down. Then we could follow best practices accordingly as well. So I would recommend anything over 8 we treat as critical, and we plan for remediation as soon as possible. We will have a custom response time and time to remediate as well. So sometimes you could get 2 to 72 hours for critical, or you could get 7 to 14 days for high. So we will present those options with you when we do provide the solution.